Welcome to the third in the Asian Development Bank's webinar series, Asian Impact, showcasing the best of ADB research in action. Today, we're discussing lockdown, loosening, and Asia's growth prospects. For some details on that, we have Abdul Abiad, Director of Macroeconomic Research in ADB's Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department here in Manila, Philippines. Over to you, Abdul.
Thanks very much, Karen. So to set the stage for this afternoon's panel discussion, I wanted to tell the story of the regional outlook in 5 charts. These are taken from the Asian Development Outlook supplement, which was released this morning, and it's available on ADB's website. Next slide, please. So this first slide shows how COVID-19 has been evolving in developing Asia. There's been a continued increase in COVID-19 cases, as you can see. The left chart shows cumulative cases. The right chart shows new daily cases. And so this increase mirrors the increase worldwide. Developing Asia accounts for about 10% of overall global cases. And currently, about 21 of ADB's 46 developing member economies now have more than 1,000 cases each, and some have numbers in the tens or hundreds of thousands. While COVID-19 started in East Asia, which is shown in dark blue in these charts, cases in that region have stabilized, and it's now the other subregions, such as Central Asia in orange, Southeast Asia in green, and especially South Asia in red, that are seeing the substantial increases in COVID-19 cases. South Asia by itself now accounts for about 60% of total cases in the region, and about 80% of new cases, as you can see on the chart on the right. Next slide, please. So in response to these outbreaks, many governments in the region have imposed lockdowns of varying intensity and duration. What this chart shows is the University of Oxford's Government Response Stringency Index. And it's a composite measure of 9 indicators, including things like school closures, workplace closures, and travel bans. And darker shades indicate more stringent containment. So what the chart shows is that many economies imposed pretty strict lockdowns starting around late March and early April. And as can be seen from the color intensity of the bars, average stringency is higher in South Asia. That's the band, that's a group of countries in the middle of the chart, and also in Central Asia, which is at the top of the chart. Stringency is relatively lower in East Asia, which is the second group from the top. But within each region, there are variations where some countries have more stringent lockdowns and others have less. Finally, what you can also see from this chart is that some economies have started loosening restrictions. Next slide, please. So these lockdowns have naturally reduced mobility in the countries. The relative stringency of lockdowns across economies, which is indicated on the horizontal axis of this chart, is strongly associated with a decline in mobility outside the home, and that's indicated on the vertical axis. You can also see the sub-regional differences in this chart. So the East Asian countries, which are in orange, are in the top left. Many of the Southeast Asian economies are in the middle, in purple. And then you see the Central and South Asian economies in the bottom right. As we show in the ADO supplement, both stringency of containment measures and declines in mobility are associated with declines in economic activity. Next slide, please. So apart from declines in domestic demand in these outbreak-affected economies, another channel through which COVID-19 will affect Asian economies is through external demand. So one heavily affected sector will be tourism, which is in the midst of a global collapse. In this chart, what you see is that for 9 economies in the region with tourist arrivals data available for April, the year-on-year decline in arrivals is extremely large. It's basically a total collapse. The decline is between 90% to 100%. And the decline in demand, in external demand, will go beyond tourism, as COVID-19 is affecting economies worldwide, as you know. So in our assessment, we expect the G3 economies of the US, Europe, and Japan to contract by 5.8% this year. Next slide, please. So this final slide is a visual representation of our updated forecasts instead of showing you a table. So our forecasts are indicated on the x-axis, and the forecast revisions relative to our pre-COVID views in December 19 are indicated on the y-axis. So the revisions in growth forecasts are on the y-axis. So 3 things to note in this chart. The first is that no economy has escaped the negative economic impact of COVID-19. All the forecasts have been revised down. Everything's below the x-axis. The second is that contractions are now expected in most economies in developing Asia. So 33 of our developing member economies are to the left of the y-axis. In other words, we expect negative growth this year. Only 12 are still expected to grow, and even those will see growth that's much lower than the growth rates they're used to. And the third thing is that the region as a whole will still manage to eke out marginally positive growth. Our forecast for the regional growth is 0.1%, the lowest in 6 decades. And the reason we still expect positive growth is that the People's Republic of China, which is the big circle on the right, is still expected to grow this year. The size of the bubbles in this chart are proportional to the size of nominal GDP. And PRC is basically about 60% of developing Asia. So bottom line, to summarize what the main message is, developing Asia will hardly grow this year, and many countries, especially those dealing with significant domestic outbreaks of COVID-19 and those which are hard hit by declines in tourism and external demand, will see significant contractions. So with that, let me end and pass back to our moderator, Karen. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you very much for that, Abdul. This, of course, is an interactive seminar, so we do very much want questions from you, the audience. If you have a question for one of the array of economists that we have with us today, please type it in the Q&A chat box on the right-hand side of the application. If you can't see that, please look at the bottom of your screen. You should see 2 speech bubbles with a question mark inside. Click on that and the Q&A chat box should appear. You can also like existing questions by clicking on the thumbs up sign to the right of existing questions. We'll of course try to get to as many questions as we can, and we'll prioritize those questions that are popular over the others. Of course, we'll get to as many as we can, as I said before. If I could just introduce our panelists, we have a number of economists from across the Asian Development Bank. They are Liaziza Sabirova. She is Principal Regional Economist with our Central and West Asian Department. Ananya Basu, she is Principal Economist looking after the Pacific region. Tiam-Hee Ng Bernard, who is Principal Economist with our Southeast Asia Department. Dominic Peschel, he's an economist looking at East Asia. And Lele Song, Regional Economic Advisor with the South Asia Department. So I'd like to kick off with a couple of questions to our panelists while we wait for some of the questions to come in. And I'd like to turn to you first, if I could, Liaziza, looking at Central Asia, our far western region of the developing Asia region. Could I ask you to give us a little bit of a snapshot of how you're seeing the economic performance in Central and West Asia?
Thank you very much, Karen, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to our viewers. Very glad to be here on this panel. Well, our region, Central and West Asia, and by that we cover 5 Central Asian countries, 3 South Caucasus countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan, of course, is facing first and foremost a health crisis. So officially recorded number of cases at this moment is about 225,000. But I have to say that, of course, testing is not widely spread out, so the real picture is probably much more dim. The biggest chunk of that is Pakistan with about 150,000 cases. But also, the situation is very fluid. Things are changing very fast. After certain improvement in, for example, Armenia and Kazakhstan, we see now a second wave of these cases. And in fact, as of now, today, the government of Kazakhstan is expected to announce new epidemiological measures and a need for mass testing. So what distinguishes our region from others is that on one side, thankfully, it's a relatively young population. For example, for the group of people above 60, 65, it's about 7%, as opposed to, let's say, a quarter of population in advanced countries. At the same time, we are very close to China, People's Republic of China and Russia. And of course, the situation in Russia is quite dire at this stage. This crisis is very multifaceted. This is the feature for, I think, many countries and many regions in the world. In addition to being a domestic health crisis, our region is also experiences an oil price shock, and it's very important for our countries, especially for oil exporting countries. And also directly and indirectly, it has effect on many aspects. It is obviously a supply shock because of many disruptions, many restrictions, lockdowns, and so on. And obviously, it is a demand shock because people lose incomes, lose jobs, and so on. So the situation is quite unprecedented, and we just saw in Abdul's slides impact on just one sector, tourism. For example, in our region, we have Georgia, and it is in fact quite unprecedented decline in tourist arrivals by 100% in April. Other data is also coming. Of course, remittances are affected. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that later. So in any case, this recession, we expect it to be much worse than the global financial crisis and also 2014-16 oil price shocks. And to exaggerate things even more, many of our countries experienced a lot of structural problems and issues even before this pandemic. So that, of course, obviously does not help. On the positive note, of course, governments in almost all of our countries, they are launching anti-crisis and also health programs. Strategies, with largest one we see in Kazakhstan. At this stage, it's about 9 minutes. And we also should not forget about the human cost of all these things, obviously. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aziza. I'd like to swing right to the other side of our region to look at the Pacific. Ananya, if I could ask you, the Pacific region, it has largely escaped the health impacts of COVID-19, but there have been really huge socioeconomic ramifications of all this. Can you take us through some of the biggest channels of that transmission?
Thank you, Karen, and hello to all our viewers. I'm Ananya Basu, and I represent the 13 developing member countries of ADB in the Pacific region. All of our economies took decisive and proactive measures to introduce travel restrictions, some from early January, and declare states of emergency. As a result, they have not had to face any major outbreaks. Fiji identified 18 cases, but eliminated local transmission and declared itself COVID-free in early June. PNG, Papua New Guinea, our biggest economy, had 8 confirmed cases, all of which have reportedly recovered. And the smaller islands, all our other 11 smaller islands, still remain COVID-free. But ironically, the very measures that prevented an outbreak of COVID have led to COVID-19 being the most significant shock experienced by the Pacific region on average. Economic and social impacts are expected to overshadow those of the global economic crisis and even those of the severest cyclones. The channels of economic transmission vary for our economies through tourism, remittances, and trade. As we saw in Abdul's charts, the tourism-based economies are particularly hard hit. Tourism receipts account for significant GDP shares and is a key source of employment and foreign exchange in the Cook Islands, Fiji, Palau, Samoa, Tonga, and Vanuatu. And some of these economies are going to see double-digit contractions in 2020. For our commodity exporters, PNG and Solomon Islands, the steep fall in commodity prices due to declining global demand will result in lower export revenues. And the smaller islands and atolls like Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, and Tuvalu, they will be affected by declining construction activity, including development partner supported projects, and also constraints on fisheries due to travel and social distancing restrictions. Remittances, which average about 10% of GDP in the Pacific, excluding Papua New Guinea, will also fall due to shrinking global employment and repatriation of seasonal workers. Tonga and Samoa will be particularly affected because they are very dependent on remittances. And since most Pacific islands are dependent on imports of essentials, including food, supply chain blockages could impact food security for most of our countries. So basically, this just goes to show that no nation is left untouched, even those which have avoided the infection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ananya, for that very rounded response. Dominic, could I go to you next? Of course, East Asia is home to the largest economy in Asia, the PRC, the People's Republic of China. How are things going there?
Thanks, Karen. That's a good question. With respect to recovery, we have been witnessing that there's good progress in restoring the industrial production, and the value chains have held up by and large. At the same time as for consumption, we still see consumption lagging behind. Retail sales were far below last year's level in the first 5 months of this year. And investment, especially manufacturing investment, is also down. So this, of course, shows you that the situation, though the industrial production has been recovering, is still in a situation where things are not certain, and the recovery is, though continuing, still rather weak. That has also to do with the real estate market that has not has somewhat picked up, but is also hit. And externally, we see that imports have been declining quite a lot. This is because of investment goods. This ties in with the previous decline I've mentioned in investment, in manufacturing investment. So since manufacturing investment down, also the import of investment goods is down quite a lot. As for exports, of course, merchandise exports to the US and the EU have been hit very hard and are far below last year's level. But let me give you a little bit more details on the outlook. So we expect a gradual recovery. For the time being, it's domestically driven. We expect more infrastructure investment to come, and monetary and fiscal policies have been loosened, and we expect a further loosening to support the recovery of the economy. With respect to monetary policy, we would expect further cuts in key interest rates, continued liquidity provisioning by the People's Bank of China, as well as regulatory adjustments to deal with potentially rising NPLs, performing loans. And for fiscal policy, we have been seeing that there's a special bond, COVID-related, has been issued, and the budget deficit has been also increased. A higher quota for new issuance of local government special bonds to finance the infrastructure is also on the way, and a lot have been issued. And with that, these are all factors that should support a gradual recovery. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Yes, a lot of detail there, and we'll certainly get to all of that detail later on. I'd like to get some inputs regarding one of the other very large economies in developing Asia, which is India and other economies in the South Asia region. Lele, could I get some of your perspective? You're actually sitting in Delhi, I believe.
Thank you very much, Karen. Yes, good day from New Delhi. I'm sitting in New Delhi. But South Asia, we have to remember, South Asia is the most populous region in the world, with more than a quarter of the humanity, 1.9 billion people. So India, Pakistan, Bangladesh are the top 10 most populous countries. So it's not surprising you to see 3 of them in the top 20 most infected countries in the world. So that's fine. And the pandemic came to the region later than other regions. And these countries in South Asia, usually they introduce lockdowns in later March. So it's quite late to the region, but it's quite worrying. You see already seeing Abdul's presentation. Daily new cases are rising in almost all these big countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and even Nepal. And these countries will be affected by the lockdowns and the spreading pandemics in the region. So their economic outlook would be affected, and huge implications by the lockdowns because the economic activity has stalled. But in the region, smaller economies, Maldives and Sri Lanka and Bhutan, they depend on the remittance and tourism. They are affected significantly, particularly Maldives. We expect a negative 11, more than 10% of contraction this year. And Sri Lanka would also expect a huge contraction this year. And for India, because India's fiscal year starts from April, finishing next March. So the full impact is on this fiscal year 2020. And we expect the Indian economy, because of the spreading pandemics and lockdown, Indian economy is going to contract by 4% this year, before growing next year 5%, slightly gradual and slow recovery. But then for other South Asian economies, because they are in fiscal year, South Asia is a bit different from other regions. Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, they are all in the fiscal year, and their fiscal year finishing in the middle of the calendar year, in the end of by the end of June or earlier July. So for these economies, actually, they managed to grow in year 2020, their fiscal year 2020, except Pakistan, because Pakistan was in macroeconomic difficulties. So Pakistan would contract a little bit this fiscal year, but then next fiscal year we expect them to still continue to grow. And for this, so for the region as a whole, South Asia is going to contract 3% this year, but before rising 4.9% next year. So over to you, Karen. I stop here.
Great, thanks very much, Lele. Yeah, again, lots to talk about. I see we have some questions coming in, which is absolutely great. Please do keep them coming. You have a lot of expertise to hand here, so we really want to tap into that. And we'll get to the first question shortly. Let's just hear first from Southeast Asia, from Bernard. You have a couple of countries that have fared pretty well in terms of the health aspects of the fallout of COVID-19. Are there any positives that you see here, Bernard, from Southeast Asia?
Thank you, Karen. Yes, I think, you know, of course, the numbers are not looking pretty. Southeast Asia being a relatively open economy will contract this year. And countries, you know, are suffering because of the drop in tourism and also because of the decline in global trade. So, but at the same time, we have some, you know, positive factors that could help us going ahead. First is, I think many of the Southeast Asian countries were taking actions fast, early, and comprehensive. So that, I think, while will inflict some initial pain on the economy, will help the economy going ahead. First is that, you know, be one of the first to implement these measures, help to contain the spread of the virus. So I think that's one of the good news. But more importantly, it also helps the country to develop the system to, how should we say, respond to possible future return of the virus, right? While, you know, so far in the initial, let's say among the first wave, things have been under control, we cannot completely rule out additional second wave or third wave. So it's important that the countries that have taken action fast are also able to sort of develop the plan and strategy to respond to the future. At the same time, another sign that we can be positive about is that, you know, we have been responding well. Countries, you know, we have been changing the way how we work. So working from home has become much more normal. Here in Manila, where I am, we've seen that, you know, there's been a lot more use of technology to work from home, and therefore we see much less time spent in traffic. So this could be a model for how the country can respond in the future. Innovations, not just related to in terms of, you know, how we work, but also this also gives us the opportunity to think about how we can build back the economy in the future, right? So this sort of gives us a glimpse that, you know, we do not have to have everything in, we don't have to have everyone going to a particular building to work. There may be a much more distributed way to work in the future. And finally, of course, I think, you know, we cannot, of course, forget about the human cost of the pandemic. And I think the positive thing is that many countries in the region now have implemented social safety net. to help those who have been impacted by the virus. And I think this is a very good opportunity that this can be continued in the future while responding to other crises. I will stop now.
Karen, you are muted.
I'm terribly sorry. I'm terribly sorry. Thank you. Let's get to some of these questions. Let's go to the first one from Kyoto. It asks about the discrepancy between the first quarter and the second quarter. Obviously, we've had first quarter GDP numbers come in for most countries, including China, for example, down 6.8%. But we've also had some good numbers, non-GDP numbers, of course, but some good industrial production numbers. How much credence should we give to quarterly data? Are we likely to see a lot of volatility? Could I go to Dominic first to talk about perhaps China and then over to Lele in India?
Thanks, Karen. As for the PRC, we have been witnessing a gradual recovery, so the Q2 data should be much better than the Q1 data. Because all the indicators that we track on a monthly basis have been improving. As I mentioned before, some are still below last year's, but also some have come back nearly to last year's level. So this is the good news. And then in the second half of the year, we would expect even a further pickup in economic activity once the situation has stabilized. So with that, we see a recovery in the PRC. As Abdul mentioned before, this is one of the reasons, or the reason why the forecast for overall developing Asia is still positive. And as I've mentioned before, the recovery in industrial production and on the production side has been quite successful by and large. What's still a weak point is retail sales, and this relates to the situation and also to the outlook, where people were certainly interested in, I guess, how the situation is now. Some of you have heard about an outbreak or some clusters in Beijing, and of course there's always of COVID-19 cases. There's always the probability or the possibility that there will be further cases, and this very much adds to the uncertainty for the outlook. But nevertheless, I mean, we have been seeing this recovery, which we expect to continue in the PRC.
Okay, to India. India, the first quarter, if in the calendar years, that's January to March quarter, which actually was the last quarter of the India's fiscal year. In that quarter, India managed to grow 3.1% year on year, because the pandemics, as I said, came to the region quite late than other regions. So it was affected a little bit, but not very much. The national lockdown was introduced on 25th of March, so only a few days in that quarter were affected. So that quarter still managed to grow, but the Indian economy was a hard hit in this quarter. And only 2 or 3 days ago, the government released the industrial production number, which was down more than 50% year on year. And then purchasing manager indices fell to historical unprecedented level in the single digit, something like 7.4. So that's this quarter, India economy would be affected significantly. But then the economy actually has already started to open up, and we see some high frequency data, energy consumption, electricity consumption, and then the mobility index, and you also see Abdul's stringency index. So the economy already started to open up from late May, and June figure would be also opening up. So probably next quarter in the economy would start to get back. So I just stop here. Over to you, Karen.
Thanks very much. We have another question coming in from Mary Chris. She asks about Southeast Asia. How will Southeast Asia fare? I think you've talked a little bit about that already, Bernard, but she asks, what are the things that can cushion the blow in this region?
Well, I think one of the key things that will cushion the how to say the impact of the coronavirus has been the very timely and very substantial government policy responses, right? We see throughout the region, the government has rolled out basically almost everything they can throw at the problem, both in terms of monetary and fiscal policy, to help cushion some of the impact of the COVID-19. We've seen new allocation given in terms of cash transfers. This has been done, I think, in Philippines. Malaysia has some version of that. Thailand has been doing that. So there has been support to those people who have been affected. And of course, businesses have also been benefiting. For businesses, one of the big concerns was, what will happen to their cash flow? So a lot of the support to businesses has been, okay, they're going to be closed down, where would they find the funds to pay the workers? So there's been a lot of support given through soft loans, liquidity support, facility that will be meant to support these small and medium enterprises who are basically very much affected by the impact of the lockdown. Not just in terms of, and also I think in terms of monetary policy, we have seen that basically there's been a lot of policy easing. Bank of Thailand has, basically brought its rate almost down to zero. I think it's at 0.5 now. Similarly, both Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, we have seen also the government being actively reducing their policy rate. In addition, there's been a whole bunch of administrative kind of measures, allowing so that, for example, there's been some countries have allowed borrowers to take longer to repay their loans, so some sort of forbearance for the loan. So this, I think, all these are widespread actions, both by the government and some by, say, the financial system, will definitely help cushion the blow.
Thanks very much, Bernard. Yes, of course, a lot of governments are spending quite a lot of money around the region to try and cushion the blow for individuals and for businesses around the region. I hope we can get to that, explore that a little bit later. But there is a question about tourism, which is a huge part, of course, of many of the Pacific economies. So Ananya, I'd like to ask you about that. How is tourism faring, particularly in the Pacific? And the question is, what is ADB's plan for tourism-dependent economies in the Pacific?
Thank you for that question. We are, of course, working with our developing member countries to help them bounce back better from the crisis. But at this point, it is important at the outset to acknowledge how little we know about what the world economy will look like in the next few years. Now, economic recovery in these tourism-dependent economies will depend partly on how quickly they are able to re-establish economic links with the rest of the world. And the outlook is quite uncertain at this point. As in all countries, Pacific policymakers are facing trade-off between opening their borders and containing the spread of COVID-19. Probably more so because their health systems are so weak that it could very easily be overwhelmed, and even their capacity to control local transmission may be quite limited. So even if travel restrictions are gradually lifted, the recovery in tourism, we don't expect it to be V-shaped, but gradual and uneven and, going back and forth. Basically, as lockdowns might come back, and tourism demand will be also constrained due to the lack of demand in key source markets and unwillingness to travel until the pandemic is controlled. Now, one area where we are looking to work with the Pacific region is in these Pacific bubbles that are being discussed, notably by Australia and New Zealand. But the risks need to be very carefully considered, as the healthcare systems in the Pacific countries are very weak. So it is first necessary to build local capacity to test, isolate, and trace cases, and also health system capacity. And we are working with all governments practically in that sphere. We are also helping their stimulus packages, which includes significant health sector response. It is also important that there be discussions on protocols for opening borders, and that discussions involved a wide array of partners and countries to adopt a common set of post-pandemic health and safety measures where feasible to encourage best practice and reduce incoherence. But at this point, we are still, awaiting further developments. It's a bit too soon, I think, to start talking about recovery. At this point, we are just working with the governments in financing stimulus packages and health sector response, and we stand ready to help them when they start to think about reopening in terms of building their health system capacity to begin with. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ananya. Yes, a lot of challenges, of course. You mentioned the shape of the recovery. There's been a lot of discussion about the alphabet that we should be applying here: V-shaped, U-shaped, W-shaped, L-shaped. There is a question coming in, is do we expect a V-shaped recovery or do we expect something else? There's even been talk about a swoosh style recovery. Abdul, you are not part of the panel, but could I ask you how you see this? What sort of shape recovery should we be expecting?
Sure, happy to take that question, Karen. So, if you look at growth rates, you might think, okay, everything's fine. So again, the forecast is for 0.1% growth this year, and for in 2021 for 6.2% growth. And you might think, well, okay, that looks pretty strong. It's not enough to offset the decline this year. So oftentimes when economists talk about the shape of a recovery, they're actually referring to GDP levels rather than GDP growth rates. And a V shape is when the impact is really just temporary and you go back to how the economy would have evolved in the absence of the shock. So, think about if you had a flood or a drought and then next year is the same, is back to normal, you would actually expect to see above average growth rates that make up for the weakness in the prior year. So put it another way, the strong growth we're seeing next year is in very large part a result of just 2020 being a weak year. And so actually, Mel, if you can pull up one of the charts at the very back of my presentation, that extra chart. There we go. So if you look at the chart on the left, that's our forecast for regional growth. The red one is for developing Asian growth. The blue line in the left chart is your growth if you exclude the newly industrialized economies. But very similar, and you might say, well, that looks pretty good. The chart on the right, it's actually a panel on the right-hand side, basically shows what's happening to GDP levels. And in the top left panel of the right, on the right side, that's what GDP levels look like. If you translate the growth rates in the left chart into GDP levels, you can see that, as she said, growth is flat in 2020. So it just moves sideways and then it starts growing again, but you're not returning to that dashed line. And a V-shaped recovery would be the chart beside it, where you fall and then you sort of bounce back to the trend line that was expected. So if you look at the three choices here, Karen mentioned the swoosh shape, that might be where we end up, but it can also look like this L-shaped recovery. And another possibility is that if what we see are recurrent waves of outbreaks that necessitate renewed lockdowns, stringent lockdowns, then you'll see dips in activity again, and you may get something like a W shape. I guess the bottom line is that this is not a V-shaped recovery. That much we feel confident in saying. What the ultimate shape will be will depend in large part on how economies do in terms of controlling their outbreaks. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks very much, Abdul. Economies, of course, are all about its people. Liaziza, you mentioned remittances a little earlier, and we do have a question in about that, if I could read it. In many countries in Central, South and Southeast Asia, remittance inflows are essential and therefore migrant movement is key. And the questioner asked for a response from each of our regions. Could I start off with you, Liaziza, since you mentioned it in your opening question? What do you see being the impact of loss of remittances and the inability of people to move across borders?
Sure, thank you, Karen. Before that, if you just allow me maybe 1 or 2 minutes to also add to Abdul's previous response on the shape of recovery and the dynamics of the economy. In our region, in Central and West Asia, in Central Asia, South Caucasus countries, as I mentioned before, the growth dynamics has been already on the downside, on a downward trend, even before pandemic. And many of our economies did not fully recover even after 2014 to 16 economic crisis, external crisis that hit our economies. So without really tackling, without addressing structural issues, fundamental issues, which are constraining economic growth, entrepreneurship, private sector development, and so on, it will be very, very hard for our economies in our region to really come back and to renew the very rapid growth which we observed in early 2000s and mid 2000s. But now coming back to remittances, indeed it is a very important issue in our region, in our 10 countries that we have. 5 of them actually have remittances, quite significant share of GDP, up to 10% of GDP. Those are Armenia, Kyrgyz Republic, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Georgia also. And 2 economies, in fact, Kyrgyz Republic and Tajikistan, they are among the top 10 remittance-dependent economies. So their remittances account for 30 to 40% of GDP, so it's a quite sizable amount. So obviously right now with all the lockdowns and depressed economic growth in, for example, Russia, which is the key source country for remittances for, let's say, Tajikistan and Kyrgyz Republic, but also for Uzbekistan, it is a big blow to people, first of all. There is a sharp decline already, although numbers are not yet there, the official numbers, but the preliminary estimates that we have for March, April, remittances declined by 30 to 50% even. For example, in Tajikistan, we estimate by 50%, but perhaps even more. Obviously, those people who managed to return and come back or did not manage to go to Russia or Kazakhstan or other countries, they will experience increase in unemployment, especially in the informal sector. And also this problem, of course, have impact on cost of COVID. It's magnifying impact of cost of COVID. In all that, we should not really forget about the human cost of these things. I think Bernard mentioned and some other speakers already mentioned that. These are numbers, but we have to understand the situation of families which are left without this very important, sometimes critical income for basic necessities, but also for education expenses. In addition to that, there is a very dire state of migrant workers who were trying to get back to their countries. For example, a lot of Tajiks and Uzbeks were stranded in Moscow airport, for example, for many days in a row without any prospect. It's a tremendous stress on people. It's tremendous human cost on these families and on these people. So obviously governments, there are certain policies that we try to recommend, and again, we can talk about that later. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aziza. A lot of our other regions also depend very much on remittances, and I'd like to go to first Southeast Asia to Bernard, and then to Pacific, Ananya, if I could. Bernard, what's the perspective on the importance of the loss of these remittance inflows?
Yes, of course, Southeast Asia, we are quite diverse in the sense that we have countries which are, how should I say, exporting workers and therefore receiving remittance, and there's also countries in Southeast Asia which are basically where the workers are, where the migrants are working and sort of sending back the money. I would, of course, in the short term, I think there's an impact because many of these migrants are working in sectors like services and tourism sector, which are currently badly affected. So there's definitely going to be a shortfall. I mean, the good news is, of course, while remittances are important for many economies, they are not the only thing. They are not dominant, right? So, in Philippines, maybe around 10% of the GDP is on remittances. So there's obviously an impact, but it's not going to bring down the economy. But what I wanted to say is a little bit more on the sort of thinking about more the medium-term and long-term perspective, right? So if we look at the sort of the changes that COVID is likely to bring about, we are going to likely move towards what we would call a low-touch or no-touch economy. So there is definitely going to be a structural shift away from using a lot of these, let's say, lower skilled workers, right? Many of the jobs that can be mechanized or can be replaced by machine, which has been, will probably be accelerated, right? So, instead of hiring a worker to wash the dishes, you may just want to put a dishwasher if there's an added cost of ensuring that the workers is being tested and so on. So I'll just stop there.
Thanks very much. Ananya from the Pacific side.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. In the Pacific, as I said in the beginning, remittances are quite significant for many economies, Samoa and Tonga being the chief among them. Tonga, it's almost 40% of GDP. And Tonga is therefore, we are projecting quite a big decline in growth this year and the next. Latest projections show a potential decline in private remittances of at least 10% for Samoa and about 13% for Tonga in fiscal year 2020 alone. And fiscal year 2020 actually ends in June for them. So it's basically quite a big decline if you think about it. Remittances are also important for Kiribati and Tuvalu, equivalent to about 10% of GDP in these countries. Now, the major source, let's say, of remittances is Australia and New Zealand. They have seasonal worker schemes for the Pacific. Australia employs about 12,200 Pacific workers. New Zealand employs about 9,600 Pacific workers, mainly from Samoa, Tonga, some also from Vanuatu, and they are basically working in viticulture and horticulture industries. So what we are observing now is that New Zealand has actually extended temporary visas of the workers who were already in New Zealand. So that has helped a little bit in terms of those Pacific workers who are already in New Zealand. They have managed to keep working, but the ones that have come back, they will obviously face difficulties in going back to work. So that's going to be an issue going forward. The other channel through which we expect to see impacts is money transfer operators. Most of these remittances are not through banks. They come through money transfer operators because that's a cheaper source of transferring remittances. And as due to the lockdowns, if money transfer operators lose their correspondent banking relationships, that could also affect remittances to the Pacific quite significantly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ananya. So challenges and opportunities there. I'm aware that we only have 15 more minutes left of the conversation. So I'd like to get through a few more questions if I could. So perhaps we could keep the responses very brief and to the point so we can get to as many as we can. There's a question here about stimulus. The US has printed $10 trillion and given away a lot of that as stimulus. I think that's true of many countries also in the developing Asian region. Will this strategy of printing money be suitable for Southeast Asian economies? I guess the question really here is that central banks have been very active in providing the stimulus, and is that an inflationary issue? If I could ask perhaps Bernard first, and then I'll go to Lele in South Asia.
Sure. I think definitely in the short term, there's no risk whatsoever of inflation. Right? I mean, we have an economy that is sort of contracting. Many of the countries are contracting. What the economy needs now is desperately, a demand. And that said, also, any attempt to sort of have the central bank finance part of the deficit has been limited in scope so far, right? So, I mean, in order to sort of, how should we say, stop inflation run away, we basically need to be extremely irresponsible and go crazy, right? So, short answer is no. And unless there's a lot more that is been doing, I don't see that happening.
Thank you for the question. So from South Asia, they haven't reached this stage of monetizing government fiscal policy, fiscal stimulus. For India, Prime Minister Modi announced a few weeks ago a package of about 10% of GDP, which actually include a lot of credit measures by the central bank, because the central bank provided a credit injection into the economy, and the Ministry of Finance actually provided some credit guarantee schemes or the lendings to SMEs to make credit easier for certain sectors in the economies. But they haven't reached the stage of financing fiscal stimulus because the economy is still, government has some limited fiscal space. In the media, there are some discussions whether the central bank should underwriting the fiscal stimulus, but this is there's no consensus. I believe the central bank, the Reserve Bank of India, wouldn't finance the fiscal stimulus yet, but they would help by the open market operations to help pin down interest rates, then to help the fiscal policy. So I just stop here.
Thanks very much. Related to that, there is a question here from Peter Macaulay, specifically related to Indonesia. How do you think, Bernard, that Indonesia will be dealing with its sharp increases in national debt?
Yes, I think of course many this is a question that I think applies to many countries in the region, right? As they sort of took on, I mean, they see a drop in the fiscal revenue. At the same time, they're rolling out all the support for all the either the businesses or the families. So definitely, countries will how should we say face a higher debt burden. But the good news is many other countries have entered this year with a much stronger, I mean, with basically a much more stronger fundamentals. So countries have generally a high level, I mean, a sort of high level of foreign exchange reserves and also relatively low level of debt. So there's definitely going to be an increase in the public debt in Indonesia, but the increase will not take them into anywhere close to a level that would be of disturbing. So definitely going ahead, Indonesia will have to look at new ways to improve their fiscal, measures. So I think they already been thinking about imposing taxes on digital services. So they're already sort of broadening the idea of the base. I think about ways that they can broaden the tax base. So as they go forward in that, I think this will definitely be one sort of they will sort of help bring down the deficit and also pay down the debt.
Thanks very much. We have another related question from ITR, which I'd like to put to Dominic, and indeed to anybody else who'd like to jump in. Should governments be piling up debt, or will this have long-term impacts, for example, on social spending going forward?
I mean, the question of debt and debt accumulation is, of course, relevant for the People's Party of China as well. It appears though the bulk of debt is not with the public, it's not public debt, it's corporate debt. So there is a kind of a different question to ask. So not only if there should be a piling up or an accumulation of debt, but also which sector of the economy should have how much debt. So I would phrase it a bit broader. And this is a very interesting question because there have been attempts before to contain leverage in the corporate sector, and the debt has declined a bit for some years, but has picked up again. And of course, in the situation that we see at the moment, it's very challenging for companies not to increase their debt a bit. It's very challenging to stabilize even debt, not possible to reduce debt, because there are a lot of SOEs and they also have a function in kind of social stability because they employ people. And if the revenue goes down of an enterprise, if they were to dismiss some of their labor force, this would add to unemployment, and then there's other costs associated with that that then has to be borne by the public. So the entire question of debt, shouldering debt and leverage is a very complex and very interesting one. Also for us as a development bank, because it has an impact on people's life directly. And so we have pointed out this kind of debt situation many times, even in previous ADOs. And if we were to think it through, if the government allows some more debt in the corporate sector, which might be necessary in order to stabilize employment, this might have also implications in the long run for the banking sector, because if the NPLs are rising, then they add up with the banks, and with the banks, they are state-owned banks. There are the questions how to deal in the medium to longer term with rising NPLs. So I just want to mention that because it's a very complex question. I want to give a glimpse to the answer, and there are more details in ADO if you're interested.
Thanks very much. Yes, a complicated question. We're getting a lot of questions in about the debt as well. One specifically related to Sri Lanka, which I'd like to direct to Lele. The question is that given that Sri Lanka has a very high fiscal deficit, how would you recommend that the government finance that, bearing in mind that raising money on the debt markets has become costly?
Yeah, Sri Lanka's debt issues are quite serious. It's the public debt was already above 70%, and because of the slowdown economy, and the government needs a fiscal deficit to fight the pandemics and also to save livelihoods. So debt would continue to grow in the next few years. But then the international community definitely has to help the economy, because it was affected by the impact of the COVID-19, not only on tourism, on remittances, but also the exports. So the international community, ADB is part of it. So we are discussing with Sri Lanka, and definitely we would have support to Sri Lankan government. But Sri Lankan government, as Dominica mentioned, actually, it's also in the medium and the longer term issue. So in the medium to longer term, Sri Lanka has to do public finance reform, SOE reform to strengthen its public financial positions, then to get the debt on the sustainable paths. And another debt serious country is Maldives in South Asia. Yeah, Maldives has also quite high level of debt, but then recently IMF has approved a rapid credit facility to Maldives, and ADB has also provided support to Maldives. And the Maldives government actually provided the commitments to the medium-term fiscal consolidation and also the debt management practice, including negotiation debt bilaterally. So these are all, you have ways in the short term and in the medium long term to address debt issues for those economies. I just stop here.
Thank you very much. I'm aware that we've come close to the top of the hour. There's still a few outstanding questions, but I don't think we really have time to get to those, unfortunately. But I just would like to say thank you to our economists participating today, Ananya, the Aziza, Dominic, Bernard, and Lele. Thank you very much for your insights. Of course, the ADO, the Asian Development Outlook Supplement, is on the ADB website. Look at www.adb.org. I'd like to thank the participants. I'd like to thank you, the audience, as well. And to let you know also that our next webinar will be on the 8th of July at 3 p.m. Manila, Hong Kong, Singapore time. That is GMT plus 8 hours. And the topic then will be COVID-19 and dollar funding strains. Thank you very much for participating.